Okay.
Just see. It didn't give me a choice, so.
You have no choice.
Oh, so somebody just asked, we are going to attempt to record it. Yes.
And Diana, are you going to follow chat for us, or do we need to?
Yep, I can follow chat for sure.
Okay, thank you. Because once you share it, it's kind of weird how to get up.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Too many windows.
Too many windows.
I don't know if I'll be able to answer the question, but I'll monitor it.
Well, and we can pause in between and just say, are there any questions? That kind of thing too, for sure.
Okay, sounds good.
I do wonder how Zoom is going to change education in general, and everything.
Yeah.
Because we see that we're capable of doing it now, right? So it's like, I don't know.
Never have to interact with people ever again.
The introvert part of me is like, I like that.
Yeah, I was about to say.
I've got a little extrovert too, so.
Yeah, I'm more extrovert than introvert, but the 60% extrovert's about to go crazy here, so a little bit. But at the same time, I go into a store and I'm like, okay, there's too many people. So I don't know.
All right, so we're at 10:02. I think we'll go ahead and get started, everybody. We've got about half here who said that they would be here, so maybe some more will trickle in. Thank you all for being here today. We're very lucky to have both Julie Gaines and Ed Spear here to give their very popular presentation. When pre-pandemic times, we'd have a full house for this, so it's nice to see we have a pretty big virtual house for this today. But they're going to be talking about systematic reviews. They both have a lot of experience with this. Ed Spear is the clinical information librarian at the UGA Medical Partnership, and Julie Gaines is the campus director of the library there. So thank you all very much for being a part of our Spring into Research series. And Julie and Ed, I'll turn it over to y'all.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started with the slide presentation, but if at any point y'all have any questions, feel free to put it up in the chat window, or unmute yourself and just shout it to the entire room. That'll work too. Just no Zoom bombing, no fart noises, anything like that. That's all we ask. So we are going to be talking a little bit about systematic reviews, and it is kind of a hot topic now. There's certainly a lot out there now. So I think it's really helpful to sort of talk about definitions, talk about what a systematic review actually is, particularly if you're in a position where you're thinking about doing one, or maybe you've had like your PI or your course instructor say, hey, you should do a systematic review. It's important to sort of go in with open eyes in terms of what that entails. So I'll try to advance the slides. So certainly systematic reviews are increasingly important. So that is kind of a scary looking little graph, but that actually does do a really good job of showing where the literature is right now. I do want to point out that's actually a proportional graph. So it's not just the thing in PubMed where everything's gotten more popular since 1977. It's that proportionally, systematic reviews, if you do that search for systematic subset, you're actually looking at over 2,000 results per 100,000, which is a pretty good number. So that's obviously something that people are doing a lot more, paying a lot more attention to now, especially in these COVID times. But I do want to point out that just because we're seeing a lot more of those does not mean that the entirety of PubMed these days is systematic reviews. I mean, indeed, even if we're talking about reviews in total, there's still a lot of things that are not systematic reviews, that are sort of like conventional narrative reviews or scoping reviews or something else. So it's really important to keep in mind what our definitions are when we're talking about a systematic review. Because indeed, reviews do come in different flavors. I won't read every single piece of text on this slide out. That would probably take the rest of the presentation. But I do want to point out that, we can talk about critical reviews, we can talk about meta-analyses, we can talk about mixed studies, we can talk about scoping reviews. Actually, Julie and I were just recently involved in helping put the search strategy together for a scoping review. And all these are sort of different flavors. But the thing that makes a systematic review really important is that I like to say a systematic review is kind of a promise you're making to your reader and to the literature as a whole. Because when we say we're doing a systematic review, what we're saying is that we have gone through, in a very purposeful, deliberate way, tried to could get as much stuff about our topic as we possibly can. So again, this is really different from the sort of classical narrative review where maybe you have a practitioner in the field that has some years under her belt, or maybe you have a graduate student that's really immersed in literature, trying to do sort of a 30,000-foot overview and say, well, this is what's important about this topic. Instead, a systematic review is literally you're trawling through the literature, trying to turn up as much stuff as you possibly can about that topic. And importantly, not only going through and getting as much stuff as you possibly can about that topic, but actually extracting information from those items that you found, and putting it in a way that other people can use it. So we were talking amongst us just a little bit, just a couple of minutes ago, where this notion of systematic review has kind of emerged in the biomedical literature, but it's sort of finding its way to other kinds of literature as well. Because really, what a systematic review is all about is that you have put in the hard work, your team has put in the hard work to find everything you possibly can, distill it down, because you recognize that not everybody has that kind of time in their hands. Not everybody has the expertise to do that. So what you're trying to do is save the time of the reader. You're really trying to do as good of a job as you can to sort of put something together that's of worth for other people. So you can actually see systematic review as not only kind of a promise that you're making to your reader, but kind of a service you're doing for scholarship as well. And it is a process. So, we talk about really being deliberate about our process. So we're talking about formulating a review question in a thoughtful way. We're talking about looking for previous systematic reviews or other kinds of reviews. We're talking about writing down a protocol. We'll talk more about what that is in a second. Talk about devising a search strategy, actually doing the search, deduplicating, because once you get all that stuff and deduplicate all that stuff, you're literally going to screen it all by hand. Um, some people talk about doing more algorithmic automated things. The jury's kind of out in terms of how well that works. There was a presentation, I think, just the last Medical Library Association meeting, where they were sort of looking at these automated ways of going through this process and found out that it didn't necessarily work that well. So there really is a lot of hands-on work involved, which again is why if you're going to do a systematic review, you're going to make that kind of promise to your readers. You're going to have to sort of know what that entails. Going through, extracting data, synthesizing data, we're going to talk about all of these steps as we go forward. But the basic steps are defining your question, constructing your search, selecting the relevant items that come up from that search. We'll talk more about what relevant item is in a moment, analyzing what you found, and then finally reporting that out. So it is a continuous process, and it is a process where really we want to make sure that we have that end goal in mind before we begin it. Because again, to my mind, a systematic review that doesn't end up with some sort of conclusion that you can convey to your reader, or at least the conclusion that maybe there's not enough data to make a conclusion, then it's kind of, why did you even bother? So again, it is extraordinarily important that if we're talking about a systematic review, we're talking about starting with a very broad scope, as broad of a scope as we can handle for our research question. So again, a systematic review attempts to collect and analyze all evidence that goes towards answering a specific question. And I'll point out where this came from. This came from the CDC publication on systematic reviews. So you can sort of read that at your leisure if you would like to. But this is a really important point, and sometimes I think not everybody gets this or sort of knows what this entails going in. So again, it's not that we're going to say, well, I'm going to find everything there is in the literature about cancer, because that would be insane. But if you're studying a particular kind of cancer, say you're looking for treatments of stomach cancer, then you literally are going to go through and try to find every relevant item you possibly can that deals with the treatment of stomach cancer. So it's defining what your question is and sort of accepting the fact that you're going to have a very broad scope, as broad of a scope as you can manage in terms of answering that question, is the first step when doing a systematic review. Because to do this right, you are going to have to review a lot of items. So this is the PRISMA flowchart. We'll talk more about what a PRISMA flowchart is here in just a second. Cognitive impairment associated with increased mortality rate in patients with heart failure, where they did their broad scope. They did their scope as broad as they needed to be, and they found 215 items. And they had to go through, deduplicate those 215 items, and sort of figure out, actually 231, excuse me, and then go through and figure out what the relevant items from that portion of records were. But honestly, 231 is pretty good for a systematic review. This is the sort of more typical case, particularly if we're looking for broad questions in the biomedical literature. You're talking about doing a search strategy where after you deduplicate, you're looking over 2,000 results. So again, this is not something that one undertakes in a weekend. This is not something that necessarily that one undertakes over the course of a single semester. This is a significant investment in terms of time and effort. So this is a question that comes up sometimes. So this is one timeline. This is not to say that it's always going to take a year. If you're doing a Cochrane review, it probably will take a year because that's just how they roll. But if you're doing one for yourself, again, you can expect to spend multiple months doing it because that process of preparing your protocol, that process of testing your search, that process of figuring out exactly what your inclusion criteria are for items, and then finally, that process of screening items and then extracting the data you need from those items is actually something that is going to take a significant amount of time. So this is just sort of the benchmark they use in terms of their expectations. I'm not saying that you're always going to take a year for your purposes, but it probably will take several weeks. So in terms of resources, the good thing about a systematic review is it's not bench science and that you don't need access to a large hadron collider. You don't need access to banks and banks of mice or banks and banks of tissue culture cabinets. But what you do need is time, and what you do need is people, because ideally you have at least two people going through each and every item, because that process of selecting items and that process of deciding which items are relevant is in some ways kind of at the heart of what we're doing when we're doing a systematic review. So we can't skimp on that. So ideally, you have at least two people going through. If you have more people, that's great. You can sort of spread the work around. Not everybody has to look at all 2,000 items. Ideally, you also have some sort of content expert. Julie and I would probably say it's really important to have a librarian on the team to sort of go through your search strategy. Because again, when you look at systematic reviews, and I would argue you should begin any process by looking at systematic reviews to see what other people have done, particularly if you're beginning one yourself. Sometimes you see horrible search strategies. Sometimes you see, oh, we went to EBSCO and searched for the word cat and looked at everything. No, you didn't. No, that's not what happened. There's literally a million things that come up with the word cat. That's not what you did. Tell us what you did. We'll talk more about in a second about the process of documenting things. So ideally, you have somebody who's a subject domain expert to help work through your search, not only your search strategy, but also your research question. But it's a good idea to have somebody that knows how to search, help you do the search piece as well. And certainly, if you're going to do any kind of meta-analysis, if you're not a statistician yourself, please consult a statistician. And we'll talk more about what a meta-analysis is in a moment. So again, the first part is we want to make sure that we're committed to the idea of collecting everything we can about a topic. The second part is we need to be really clear about what question is we're trying to answer. So we have to make sure that we clearly define our question and that we're really explicitly clear in terms of the kinds of things we're looking for. So what that means is before we really get started, and there's a little bit of a break-in process, there may be a little bit of back and forth at the very beginning, but what we really want to do is we want to be very clear about what our inclusion criteria are. So we want to be really clear. We get back a pile of stuff, whether it's 300 items, whether it's 3,000 items, what at the outset are we going to decide that we want to keep? And what at the outset are we going to decide what we want to just sort of leave aside? It's important to do this at the beginning. We don't want to ever be in a situation where we get halfway through the process and then decide to change our inclusion criteria, because then we're not being systematic. And again, systematic review is a promise that you make to your readers that you're actually doing it the way you should. Okay, cool. So that gets towards the notion of not only defining our question, but also searching our question. So I'm going to turn the slides over to Julie for just a minute, and she's going to describe a little bit more about what we mean about this search process.
Thank you, Ed. So what's interesting, and as Ed said, you have to have your question defined. And that not only helps you with your criteria, it also helps the team as we are, as you saw that list of people, everybody has to be on the same page, because That way, if different people are reviewing it, you know kind of what your criteria are, and you also are all on the same page of what question you're asking. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time as you're doing some literature searching. You're like, okay, I need to be more specific maybe. So, but anyway, as you get your question kind of defined, this is a tool that we use a lot in the medical health sciences world. These are just some tools that we use. We mostly use Pico when we're trying to define our question. But these, just remember, these are tools. These are not your end all and be all, but they kind of help you think through. And of course, today our example is going to be more medical because that's kind of where Ed and I feel the most comfortable. But hopefully, I know some of you are in different fields, but hopefully you can apply some of this. So just kind of be methodical about your questions. So the first one is Pico, and you just divide it up with patient population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. And we'll have an example in the next slide about that. Then there's some different ones that are used. So you can use your sample, phenomenon of interest, design, evaluation, research type. And then also the last tool is SPICE, is setting, like where did it happen, the perspective, the intervention, the comparison, and the evaluation. And of course, we have listed all of our and I'm assuming we'll probably provide these slides to everyone here today. You can go to all this. As good librarians, we referenced everything on the bottom of all the slides. So, okay, Ed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is Pico, as we've used, and we're just going to show, we'll kind of just show you. And we actually teach this to medical students and to residents as they are learning how to search, because it's a great way to think of a clinical question or your systematic review question. And you want to be as specific as you can be. And this tool helps do that. So, and you can do, so for this one, the clinical question, just as an example, or the question is animal-assisted therapy more effective than music therapy in managing aggressive behavior in elderly people with dementia? And so your patients, and you want to be as specific as you can. You always list your patients. It's not only age of them, but also if they've been diagnosed with something, or you think they may be diagnosed with something, basically, or going to be. So elderly patients with dementia is our patients. Our intervention would be animal-assisted therapy. Our comparison would be music therapy, and the outcome is aggressive behavior. Or another outcome, and then also you can add a couple like time and then a type of question, but for these purposes, this is what we're looking at today. And so when we search this actually helps us as librarians a lot, because, and also as you're searching, you would want to set up your search to where you could do, have all these different parts. And it's a great methodical way of searching in a way. So if you ever have a question, that's a great way to kind of break it down. So what's the importance of a good search? So we just talked about the question must be clearly defined and have inclusion and exclusion criteria. You have to have a broad and thorough search of the literature is performed. And it's great as a researcher, excuse me, I have something in my eye. It's great as a researcher to start this search, but as Diana, Ed, and I would probably recommend, it's probably good to get a librarian involved very early, because we can help you stay on track. Because sometimes if you get too far down, we have to redo the whole thing. But if we're part of the team at the beginning and the discussion, it helps. So, but for these systematic reviews, you have to do a very broad, thorough search. And you're not just doing a quick little Google search. I mean, we're talking about 5, 7, 8 databases. I mean, like, it's really extensive. So to the next slide, please. So there's some different things you want to consider when doing your search. And this is where a librarian really can help you. There's keywords, and keywords, that's just like searching Google. I mean, that's just searching just with basic words. And then versus subject headings. And most databases have a lexicon or a selected set of subject headings that would go along. And a lot of us would probably do a hybrid search of using both of those, because you want to think of all the synonyms and all the different parts and all the, but also you want to search for the subject headings too. Can you formally combine those parts of a search? So how can you, like our search a while ago, we'll have to do older people and dementia, but if you go to other databases, they may call it senior adults. So you have to think of all these different ways all these databases are being searched as well. Do you want to limit by date or by language? This is something Ed just mentioned that he and I just worked on a scoping review together, and the first author wanted to go back, do it just for 20 years, I think back to 2000 or 2010. I can't remember if it was 10 or 20 years, but you know, you have to set that, because as you're, and it's easy to do in the database, but as the librarian's helping you and everybody else is helping you, that's one of your criteria. And you've got to write that up. When you write it up, you're like, we looked at the literature from 2000 to 2020. Or if somebody else has already done a search similar to yours, you want to make sure that you maybe pick it up where they left off. So let's say someone finished at 2000, you're going to do something similar that they didn't do from 2000 to 2020, 21 or 20. And then by language, people have different, a lot of our databases that we use, PubMed is one of the bigger ones that we use. It does have multiple languages in it, but as I try to tell, I always remind people, you don't want to limit by language, but at the same time, if you cannot comprehend an article, like you may be fluent in another language, but if you can't read a medical article or a scientific article in another language, that may prohibit you. So just always consider the language and the dates, and then also your keywords and subject headings, and then also if you can combine it. All right, so we have keywords versus subject headings, and Ed, you may need to talk about this since you created this. Let me look at it real quick. Yeah, go ahead and talk about this, Ed, since this is Ed's baby. This is one of his projects he works on.
It's my baby. Thank you, Julie. So yeah, this is just basically then, or if you want to be really pedantic, maybe you'd say a Euler diagram in terms of what those different kinds of keywords and different kinds of subject headings we might use in PubMed or Medline, I guess, if we're talking about subject headings. And this is kind of those overlaps. So as you can see, when we're talking about dementia, we can be talking about all kinds of different sorts of dementia. We could be talking about Lewy body dementia. We could be talking about Alzheimer's. But as Julie just said, there is a distinction that we can make between just that keyword of dementia and that subject heading of dementia. And there are some things that will turn up with that subject heading dementia that we don't get from the keyword search, and vice versa. So again, as Julie just said, it's really important to be cognizant of the tools we have at our disposal when we're looking at a particular database, in this case, Medline.
So this is just an example of a search, and you can see how this. Okay, so we have a question. What do the TW and mesh mean? Go back one slide, please. So TW is text word. So that would be just like a keyword. And then mesh is medical subject headings. And I'm sorry, we're talking a little, sorry, we did not distinguish that. Mesh is medical subject headings. That's what we use in PubMed. It's like the lexicon they have that are like the subject headings. I call them like hashtags. It's kind of like a cool way to think about it, I guess. But every article in PubMed has 10 to 15 of those assigned to it. And it's a great way to search. But almost any database that you search will have some kind of subject headings, some kind of thesaurus with the subject headings in there. So that's what that means. Did that answer the question? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So, and I'm glad you asked that question, because this shows you an example of how searches can get very complicated. And if you're doing a systematic review, oftentimes this is included in the appendix. So when librarians or even you are searching, be sure to keep record of everything that you're searching. And this is why you want a librarian involved, because a lot of us are used to doing this and keeping it organized, and you want to make it look as good as you can. Because let's say, for example, I found this article and I'm like, oh, this is great. I want to do something similar to this. You could actually run this search again if you wanted to do it for fun on a Friday night. But if this would be something that you, I don't see what Ed is saying, I'm sorry. Anyway, so if you can see at the very top, so we're going to keep the same theme. We have the dementia, the Alzheimer, the Huntington, Kluver, Lewy, and then dementia is a MH here is a main heading, or I think that's main heading, right, Ed? And then we ordered all those together. I'm not going to go in major detail, but then we have the animal assisted. So if you look from number 18 to number 23, that is all the terms that you would use to describe, oh, excuse me, sorry, number 8 to number 23. That would be all the terms you could use for animal therapy. And then if you look at number 24 up here, that's where you put them all together. So as you can see, and that's why we use the PICO model, because it divides them all up between, like we have the patient information, which is the number 1 through 6. Then we have the animal assisted, which is number 8 through 23. And then we have the music, which is number 25 to number 33. And then we have the last part of it, right? Which were the outcomes. It is number 25 to number 46. So we have all these sets. So look at, without getting too much into this, but number 7, number 24, number 34 are all our main ideas, and number 47, that's all our main ideas put together. And then look at number 48, that's all of them put together. So you'll be using all your Boolean operators to put these. So as you can see, there's probably even more terms. Like I'm looking at this aggression one, there's probably even more terms we can do that. So let's see if are there any other questions from the chat I need to address, or y'all taking care of it, Ed and Diana?
Julie, I just answered one about the main differences between Medline and PubMed, and I want to make sure I got the distinction correct. My understanding has always been that Medline is a subset of PubMed, and those citations have the medical subject headings assigned, where there are other citations within the larger PubMed that don't have mesh.
Yeah,
is that your understanding?
well, that's kind of it, but at the same time, Medline, okay, Medline's also just the data. I always just kind of, just to make it easier to understand too, Medline's just the database on the back end, and PubMed's like the brand name. So, remember Ovid also has Medline, so does EBSCO has Medline. So that is correct what you're saying, Diana, but it's very few that don't have those citations. I mean, most of us are searching the Medline. So if you, the precursor to PubMed was Medline. It was actually in books, or Index Medicus was in books. And then when it became on the web, it became PubMed. So
And you
PubMed
probably still find those print volumes of Index
oh
Medicus.
yeah, and they came out every year. Yeah. But you're right, Diana, in what you're saying. But really, the easiest way to explain it is Medline is just the database on the back end, and PubMed is like the brand or on the front end. So
as Julie just said, certainly for older topics, there's really not that much stuff that you're going to find in PubMed that's not in Medline. So the National Library of Medicine selects journals to index, just as they used to with Index Medicus, like Julie was just describing. And so that's still the core, and that's still the preponderance of stuff that we find in PubMed. Usually when we do a search in PubMed, the bulk of the things we get back are things that are actually indexed in Medline. The one caveat to that is that there is an increasing number of things in terms of open access journals, or some things that open access journals. That's the primary subset of things that aren't actually indexed in Medline that you'll find in PubMed. And so that's when you do newer searches, because there weren't really a lot of open access biomedical journals 10 or 15 years ago. So you'll sometimes find some things, sometimes slightly sketchier titles. So a little bit of buyer beware when you find something that's not indexed. But there's also some things in general purpose, like sciencey kinds of things that are medically related. There'll be like the odd article or two that'll get indexed, that'll be in there. So yeah, it's a little bit of a catch-all as we get more and more recent in time. But as Julie just said, the preponderance of things that we see in PubMed is those Medline indexed things.
Yeah, I kind of see them synonymous in a way, just to make it easier sometimes. But so if you see Medline like in EBSCO or Ovid or whoever, I think y'all have probably Medline through EBSCO, or Galileo has it through EBSCO, I think. That's the same as PubMed. But we always use PubMed because you can search PubMed for free from anywhere. And not that everything's full text in there, but it is free. So you can go to pubmed.gov and get there anywhere. You don't have to be attached to a university or anything. So here are some possible resources. So we just looked at a huge search, and not only are the searches, but the other thing is you want to run the same search or similar search in every database. That's the other reason you want to document it, because you're not only, so we'll use that big search we just did, and okay, how does it translate? So we have PubMed, Web of Science, which is a good way to search in a big We have access to that. Google Scholar, which a lot of you have access to, and I'm not sure what the asterisk means, Ed, but anyway, I love using Google Scholar for different ways, but just remember we do have access to that, and UGA has a way that you can link back to the articles. And then also discipline-specific databases. So that search we just talked about, of course, we'd use as many medical as we could, but I'd probably look at some psych info because it does talk about dementia. That would be it. So there's different ways of looking at searches, right? We look at the medical part, but what else are we looking at? Because not every database has the same journals in it, or the same, it may be a subject matter, but you're like, oh, okay. And some databases do have the same journals, and you'll start seeing a lot of duplication. And that's a big part of the search too, is taking those out. And then we have gray literature, and gray literature is basically, just to sum it up really quickly, it's just things that are not published yet, but they're like reports, government reports, conference proceedings, and these are some places to look. And there's also other lists for that. Another way to find information is doing hand searching. So, for example, let's say if you're in this class right now, you probably are a grad student or a faculty member, or you know some of the top journals probably, and if not, you need to probably talk to someone that you're working with, your advisor, whomever, and find out what are some of the big journals. And you would probably just you go through their table of contents. I mean, I know that sounds, you really shouldn't. Let's see. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Julie.
It's okay. No, that's okay. No. I didn't realize you'd answer. Sorry. I was like, okay, what's that mean? Did I just say something? No, you were like, no, I just really shouldn't. Okay, sorry. Anyway, and so we have the conference proceedings, and then hand searching, and then snowball selection citations from other reviews. So that's like looking at bibliographies. I use Google Scholar a cool way. Like if there's a really, really, really good article that's really on topic for what I'm looking for, and I use this not just for systematic reviews, for any kind of research when I'm helping somebody. You can put a citation into Google Scholar and see who else has cited it. Not only who they've cited, but who has cited that article. So if you find an article from, let's say, 2015, and you want to see who has cited that article in the last 6 years, you can find it on Google Scholar. So there's different ways. Do not forget to look at the bibliographies of some of these really good articles. That's another way to get really good articles as well. So David asked a really good question, and this is a rule of thumb, and just something to always remember. Always pull the full text. Remember, authors write their own abstracts. And just remember, we have a great interlibrary loan department at UGA, and it is free to interlibrary loan an article, and they can get anything for you. And if you actually put one in, and if you don't know how to do that, Diana and her team can help you. Chat, if you go to chat on the UGA, but interlibrary loan is one of our coolest tools, and what that does, it gets it from another library. But another thing to sometimes do is just Google the title, because sometimes people put it up as a PDF and they shouldn't be doing that, but you can grab it that way too. But that's probably not the best way, but you can interlibrary loan and get it from another library. Okay, Ed.
And I may have misunderstood your question, David. So it is possible to take a look at the abstract and know that it's off target.
Oh, yeah.
So it's possible to look at the abstract and go, no, that's not for me. I don't have to bother with it anymore. But what you cannot do is say, oh, this is really good. I want to include it in my review, and then not actually pull the full text.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And if you're kind of on the fence about it, go ahead and pull the full text, because you can read the full thing and just make sure. So
Julie,
yes.
There was one more question about hand searching. And I know you talked a little bit more about that, but can you talk about the cherry picking of journals?
Yeah, that's kind of tough. And the thing is that there, unfortunately, not that I know of, there's not just these lists of like, well, you can Google it and say top 10 list in psychology of journals or whatever, or the top impact factor. But sometimes those aren't the best. I mean, you really need to start maybe looking. When you start searching, you'll start noticing the same journals show up over and over. That's a great way to see what journals are some of the top journals that are being published on your topic. Ed and I, the scoping review that we just did was a one on teenagers and their attitude, female teenagers and their attitudes toward their menstrual cycle and some other, but that's a very public health type, but there are some very specific journals that I had never seen before. And you start seeing those same journals come up. So that's what you need to look. And then also you want to go, you can do a search in PubMed by putting just the title of that journal in, or in other journal, and just pulling up all the articles that have been published. And that's one way of doing it. Or you can go to the journal's homepage and just pull their table of contents and just quickly look through them, because you'll find them. I mean, you'll start, and then some of these journals do these issues where they're just subject focused. So let's say, for example, the study we were doing, we were just looking at, and it talked about music therapy. Maybe there's some music therapy journals, and then one of them is or pet therapy, and there's different ones that talk about that. You know, you just have to like go through some of those. So, but like for that search, we did it as an example. There may be a dementia journal that would be great on that list. There may be some good music therapy journals that would be an animal therapy. So you just kind of, because there's journals that are so specific you wouldn't even imagine until you start searching sometimes. Does that answer your question? Okay, and we can and the librarian, you know, we can help you, but I think you really have to find somebody who's like a subject, and that's another person you want to maybe add to your team as a subject specialist, somebody who maybe has published on your topic before, because they can help you think of like other terms for your search, and or maybe look over your search as well. So this is let's go back to the PowerPoint. I'm sorry. So the next things, you want to make sure you're documenting your methods, and these are just some examples of how to do that. Just be sure you take copious notes and make sure everybody's on the same page. And every database that you do, you should be able to save your search. Be sure you do that, because that documenting at the end, because you've got to publish that, and most people want to see that as an appendix. So just be sure. And also, to get, before I finish, be sure, like, pull some example systematic reviews and read what they do, because there's some good ones out there, and they'll go into detail and describe their search. And it's best to include that you used a librarian. That would really make all of us happy. So okay, Ed.
Indeed. So in terms of, so again, as we said, that first part is figuring out what it is you're going to try to answer in terms of your question. That second part is actually putting your search together. But another thing you can think about doing, is not, you know, sort of explicitly absolutely necessary, but it's a good idea, is to set a protocol. So not only sort of document for your own purposes what your search strategy was and what databases you use, but also actually write it down in a sort of methodical, deliberate way. Because when we do that, we're sort of keeping ourselves honest. So as Julie just said, it also helps that last process of publishing, so we can actually document what we did, but also helps us keeps us honest in terms of not changing the rules halfway through. But you know, it is a little bit of an iterative process, just like defining your question and doing your search. So you may find yourself modifying or editing that protocol a little bit at the beginning, but just so long as you have it locked in more or less before you get started, that's really what the end goal is. Now you can go to the step of actually registering your protocol. And this is, again, so a lot of people talk about reproducibility in science these days. We can also talk a little bit about reproducibility in terms of doing these reviews. Because again, if you rigidly define what your inclusion criteria are and rigidly define what your search strategy was, then ideally somebody could come along and duplicate your results. So the idea of registering your protocol, sort of putting it out there before you even necessarily get started actually sorting items, is something that, you know, again, kind of sort of documents your process and sort of helps sort of keep you on track. But again, the meat in terms of what we're doing when we do a systematic review is that screening process. Um, Now you're probably going to discard most of what you find. That has to be the expectation going in. You're not going to keep half of what you find. You're not going to keep a quarter of what you find. You're probably only going to keep like 2% of what you find. Because typically when we're doing a systematic review, we're trying to answer a very specific question. So if I'm trying to find things about treatment of stomach cancer, I'm primarily going to be looking at randomized controlled trials of treatments of stomach cancer. So if it's not an RCT, or if it's not about stomach cancer, or it doesn't really answer my question, then it goes by the wayside. So by defining that inclusion criteria, then I get to decide what it is that I keep. But again, you're not really going to keep most of what you find. Um, So again, having that process of not only defining the inclusion criteria, but also defining who's going to make that decision is going to be a tiebreaker if one person disagrees with another. And can you automate any part of that process? Now, again, where the technology is these days, we probably can't automate the selection process. That probably has to be done by hand. That's intellectual work. But the sort of scut work of managing sort of, okay, so Cindy's going to look at citations 1 through 500. Tommy's going to look at citations, 750 to 1,000. And Julie's going to be the referee, and she's going to decide, she's the tiebreaker if they disagree. You could manage all that manually with pieces of paper, or even an Excel spreadsheet. I would argue, though, you probably want to use a purpose-built tool. Now, if you have a PI that has a bunch of grants, you could think of, and I just love how they still call it Covidence. It's like, really, guys, you couldn't come up with a different, I mean, I guess there's branding and stuff at this point. You can't really change the title, but I don't think I would want to use something that has COVID in the name. But Covidence is a commercial tool that's used by a lot of people that do this many times. Distiller SR is another example of a commercial tool where if you have a well-resourced team and you want to spend a little bit of money, but again, that's not doing the work of deciding what to keep and what to exclude. It's just managing that process of helping people look at stuff. But there are a couple of free options as well. So Rayon, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Abstractor. The links to both of those are off this slide. Those are both free versions of this idea that sort of manage that process of putting citations in front of people's noses and registering what their decisions are and helping you keep track of what you've decided is good and what you've decided is bad. But again, the end point, once we've done the difficult work of figuring out what it is we're going to try to answer, defining our inclusion criteria, and that sort of laborious process of trawling through the results that we get from our searches, then we have to analyze the stuff that we kept. Because again, when we do a systematic review, usually we're trying to answer some sort of defined question. So we have to critically analyze the search results and pull actual data from those search results. Now, if we're talking about quantitative data, so if we're talking about the kind of data that people usually handle in the biomedical field, the kinds of systematic reviews you would find most typically with a PubMed search, there's typically going to be some sort of meta-analysis step at the end. Probably, well, I couldn't talk for half an hour about meta-analysis because math makes my brain go hurdy. But if you're talking about statistic stuff, we could spend a lot of time talking about meta-analysis tools and techniques, but basically the 30,000 foot view is that meta-analysis is this rigorous process of trying to look at people's data. Usually they're published data, but you could actually do this with unpublished data as well if you could find it, and actually try to summarize it. So we have 5 different studies. 3 different studies say X is a good idea. 2 different studies say it's not a good idea. So what's the actual answer? Because even studies that are in broad agreement, just because the nature of reality, are not going to have the exact same answers. Usually, even something that we have a pretty good sense of what's going on, there's going to be slightly different information in different studies. So meta-analysis, this process of trying to combine lots of disparate data sets and get some sort of answer, excuse me, because the theory is that the more data we have, the better we can trust the answer that we're looking at. And so if we're looking at lots and lots of different studies, theoretically, we should be able to combine all those different studies and get a better, more rigorous answer than looking at one study in isolation. And that's, if you look at systematic reviews, this is the sort of thing you'll see as a readout. If you're looking at meta-analyses, this is just a forest plot. So basically, this is just a way of saying, here's all these different studies. They have different ends. They have different degrees of rigor. They have different, sort of standard deviations. So this is just one way of plotting all of them together and seeing how many of them seem to come to some sort of actual conclusion versus ones that came to no conclusion at all or decided they really couldn't come to a conclusion because their data didn't really suggest one way or the other. So in terms of performing one of these, again, if you're not a statistician yourself, I would absolutely encourage you to talk to a statistician. But that statistician, or if that statistician happens to be you, you're not going to be doing this by hand. You're not going to be doing this like in a long ledger with like a slide rule or pencils and paper and everything else. You're going to be using some sort of piece of software. There is a purpose-built piece of software called Open Meta. I think it's by the same people that do Abstracker. I'm not sure off the top of my head. There's a link to that there. If that again is sort of this open source deal or free to use deal. But also, you could use a general purpose piece of statistical software like R or Stata or SAS if you have that capability. But you're definitely going to be doing something in terms of crunching numbers if you say you're doing a meta-analysis. But obviously, systematic reviews are not only done in the biomedical domain. And actually, systematic reviews these days are not only done for quantitative data. We can actually talk about doing a systematic review of a qualitative data set as well. But just as if we're talking about quantitative data, there has to be some sort of summary step. There has to be some sort of figuring out, can we find an answer to our question? In terms of how we actually do that, there's not as many models to work from. There's not something like a forest plot that we could use for qualitative data. As Julie said a little while ago, it's a really good idea to start the process by looking at other systematic reviews and sort of seeing how they went about summarizing what they found. It's going to be very dependent on what your question actually is. But again, just as with quantitative data, ideally we want to have some sort of actionable result at the end of that process. So even if we're talking about qualitative or mixed methods kind of data, you want to make sure that you end it with some sort of publication that comes to some kind of conclusion. Even if that conclusion is, hey, I looked as hard as I possibly could for data, the data is not good enough to actually decide what the answer is. Because again, that notion of closing that cycle, reporting out those results, is in many ways kind of the most important step. Just if we're talking about reporting out, some sort of study or reporting out some sort of piece of bench science data, it's nice to do the work. It's nice to sort of satisfy ourselves what the answer is, but ideally we want to be able to share that answer. We want all of that work to have been for some good purpose. So we want to make sure that we report out those results. So in terms of figuring out how to report out those results and how to sort of document your process in your final publication, we want to look at something like Prisma, preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses website. This gets updated every so often. I think the main web page hasn't been updated very often, but like for instance, for doing scoping reviews, they just recently issued a new revision of their scoping review suggestions in terms of what you should do. But that just goes through this long checklist and say, okay, so make sure that your title, it says what you're going to do, make sure you have a structured summary in your abstract, make sure you have rationale and objectives, because again, we want to make sure we're keeping ourselves honest. We want to make sure we're documenting for our readers what we did, because again, we want to try to add to the literature. And the more explicit we can be in terms of our process, in terms of what we looked at, in terms of which our inclusion criteria were, and in terms of the methods we use to summarize things, the more useful to our readers that publication is going to be. So again, just to reprise, the basic steps is we define our question, we construct our search. Again, that's a fair bit of work. Then we select those relevant items. That's probably the most time-consuming part. Maybe not the most intellectually challenging part, but certainly the most time-consuming part of the whole thing. We analyze what we decided to keep, and then finally we close that cycle. We report out what it is that we found. Cool. So this is contact information for me and for Julie. We do have a couple of minutes to answer questions, so please have at it.
We've gotten the question if these slides would be available, and I'm pretty positive we'll be sending them out. I'm sure Diana will be sending them out to the attendees. I don't know if there's a way to do that, but
Yeah, I have the attendee list in
Okay.
Zoom. So if y'all send them to me, I will
okay.
send.
All right, for sure.
Hi, this is just a general statement. This was a fantastic presentation. I'm a professor in communication sciences and disorders, and I think that this information is really relevant, in particular to our doctoral students. So if we had students who wanted to actually work with the librarian on projects, would you say that you're pretty backlogged, or is it something that is a real doable thing in the near future?
Diana, that would probably be more up your, I don't know. I'm fully committed to the medical school, so I can't really, I'm happy to maybe assist another librarian to maybe review. I've done that a lot, but I can't be the lead because I'm just so dedicated to all the medical students here, because I am fully dedicated to all of our undergrad medical students. But at the same time, you know, Ed and I both are happy to review and help other librarians. But Diana, you may want to answer that directly since you're full-time UGA.
So I'm sorry, did you say you're in communication studies? Is that what I heard correctly?
No, communication sciences and disorders. So speech and hearing science, audiology, speech pathology.
Is that under education?
Yeah, we are located in the College of Education, but we're very medically based.
Yeah.
So
Gotcha.
yeah.
I would start with Carla Buss. You know, she attended this training last year, and I think she is getting more and more requests to help with systematic reviews. She can always collaborate with any of us at the science library, and we're happy to facilitate that process. There's also the public health librarian, Casey Robertson, is very well versed in helping with systematic reviews. But I'd start with Carla, and then she can bring whoever else in as needed.
Yeah, we've actually helped Casey. That's who Ed and I've helped a lot, you know, some with public health. And Sandy, you know, feel free. It's not that you can't contact us. I may just have to, it's just our schedule and that kind of thing. Because, but at the same time, I understand that y'all are very medically based. So you do need, you know, it's kind of odd. I understand that part, but feel free. If you have any questions outside of this, I'm sure Ed and I'll be happy to answer them. And if we need to direct you to another librarian or something, but just want to give you a heads up, kind of how our direct line of chain of who we're responsible for type thing. So just FYI.
Okay, wonderful. That's super helpful. And you said Casey Robinson or Robertson?
It's actually Robertson, Roberson. If you want to contact me directly, I'm going to put my email in the chat. You can start with me. I help with this type of literature review more and more these days because I'm the vet med librarian. But as we were saying earlier, it's definitely trickling down to other disciplines. So I've even been helping in the natural sciences. But yeah, Casey Robert, let me find his email too. Hold on one second.
Wonderful, thank you.
And Sandy, you know, this may be the type of thing, if you feel like this class is something that, you know, because Ed and I'd be happy to do. I mean, I'm speaking for Ed, but if we have time, you know, this is just 1 hour, we're happy to come to a class and do this, if that would be helpful too. Or if Diana wants to do something, I mean, you know.
That's fantastic. You will hear from me. Thank you.
Excellent.
Because that may be a better way to approach it too, is teaching the students early about this. That way you kind of stop some of the error. You know, what we really see is a lot of people start searching so early and don't document it very well, and they don't know they don't know. And if you start early and start good practices early, that really helps.
And then I think David asked who the contact person was for social work, and I accidentally sent it as a direct message to somebody else, but it's Amber Prentice. And her email is amberp, AMBERP @uga.edu. And I put her email in the chat. She, along with Casey Robertson, have been looking into this format, so they'll know about how to conduct.
Yeah. And we're happy to team teach. I mean, all of us librarians, we work together and kind of help each other out with all this. So yeah, just contact some of us and we'll help you. So.
Cool. Any other questions about the process or kind of the tools that are used, or? Well, I will take that as Julie and I managed to completely explain systematic reviews then.
It's just a lot and it takes a lot of practice. But I think if there's some major takeaways is document, 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 and get a librarian involved as early as you can. That's
And
that's
again, to be
exactly what I would say.
And again, just be really cognizant in terms of what it's going to involve. So
Yeah.
I don't want to be in a situation where it seems like I'm encouraging you not to do a systematic review. 'Cause obviously, we wouldn't be doing this class if we thought doing a systematic review is a bad idea. But just be really aware that you're not going to do a systematic review for the second half of a class. It's not going to be some sort of project that you're going to knock out in a couple of weekends. I mean, you could do, and sometimes you even see things that are published that seems like they were knocked out in a couple of weekends. But frankly, if you're not doing something methodical, deliberate in a systematic way, you're not actually doing a systematic review. So you shouldn't say you're doing a systematic review unless you're actually going to put in the time and effort and intellectual discipline to actually do a systematic review.
Yeah, because that could just be a literature review at that point. So, and so be careful, some literature that you find that is listed as systematic review in the title. Remember the authors title things. It may not be a total systematic review like we've discussed here. So be very careful of that too.
So, in terms of Sandy's question, the difference between systematic review and scoping review. Scoping review, I mean, all of these terms are sort of squishily defined. Systematic review is probably the best defined of all the sort of terms, but people use other terms for other kinds. Scoping review is basically trying to say, well, the question that I'm looking at is not yet so well defined that I can even really say I can systematically review it yet. So instead, what I'm going to try to do is sort of do like a little bit of cartography or a little bit of, reconnoitering for other people. So other people behind me can read my scoping review, get a better sense of what the discipline actually says about something, and then maybe use that information to actually do a systematic review of their own. So typically, if we're talking about a scoping review, we're trying to sort of define what the literature is, but we don't necessarily have that end product of saying, well, I've looked at the 5 studies, that I only kept 5 studies, and I'm trying to summarize those 5 studies. Instead, it's saying, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to tell you about all the kinds of stuff that I found. Same thing with the comprehensive review. That's actually not a term I'm super familiar with. I would imagine a comprehensive review is something more akin to a narrative review. Again, if it doesn't say systematic on the tin, I would argue it's probably not a systematic review. They probably would have called it if it was that. So there's other kinds of reviews, and they all, are useful in that they're trying to sort of summarize the literature in one way or another. But a systematic review that we've been talking about combines that rigorous process of searching with a rigorous inclusion criteria, and then finally some sort of attempt to summarize that literature to answer a specific defined question. Where with other kinds of reviews, we're not necessarily going to get that because it's just different kinds of reviews. Hopefully that answers y'all's questions.
And I think, Ed, if I remember correctly, there's a good slide in here that has definitions of all those different kinds of reviews. So that'll be available when we send the presentation around.
Yes.
And be sure to look at all the citations we have at the bottom of each slide, because there's so much more information there. I mean, there are systematic review classes that last for a week. I mean, like these can last for a long time. So we're putting a lot in 1 hour. So be sure to use the references that we have at the bottom. Ed did such a good job of creating this PowerPoint and like making sure that way, because it's good for you to reference that back and look at it and read more in depth past this class. So.
And I'll mention one other thing. If you're in the health sciences and you want to look at a systematic review, PubMed has that filter, and it's a really good filter. So you can do a search very broadly for what your term is, limit to systematic reviews, and look at one just to get a feel for what those would look like. And yes, we will be providing this presentation to everybody who's attended today.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and your questions and for your attention to this. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Julie and Ed. We really appreciate it. This is great, as always. Always learn something when I attend this.
Excellent. Well,
Happy,
thank y'all
happy
so
to
much.
do it. Yeah, thank you for being here and let us know if we can help in any way.
Great. Bye, everybody. Have a good one.